Parental separation can be tough, and the idea of having to navigate a co-parenting relationship with someone that you don't like can be even more overwhelming. But you don't have to navigate this on your own. We welcome you to the White Table discussion, where we bring to you real life stories with real people discussing subjects, stories, most importantly, also the heartfelt messages of parents and children. Most important, every week we will have professionals to give you advice and guidance, but also bring you some of those other people maybe like yourself that have already been where you are now, to help to guide and give you some advice at that level of understanding from the emotional home. Most important, if you're here to hang around and hear us a little bit more, every week we will be bringing you stories. All you need to do is hit that subscribe button so that we can do more for you and helping to build this community whilst we've been running now in our 5th year of the White Table Discussion Project. My name's Jeannie. I'm your host and the founder of Parenting Together Apart for Parents Not Together. I look forward to seeing you inside. Hi everyone, so welcome to another edition of White Table Discussion, and today we have Dr. Stan Carossi with us. Thanks, Stan, for joining us today. I think today what would be ideal, given the changes of the Family Law Act coming up in June, is to really talk through about the lens of the family relationships and in the context of child-parent relationships, and how the changes are highlighting the impacts through, not only domestic violence, but also through the, parental alienation and what that means, based on your perspective and work that you're also doing and the work we're doing together, of course. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Jeannie. A pleasure to be here again. So it's a big topic, and I'll start out by approaching it this way. The core business now of family law in Australia and in other parts of the world as well is resolving issues of child safety in the context of their relationships with their parents, and addressing a child's best interests, which at best is a rather vague concept, but in Australia it is framed almost exclusively in terms of their safety. Okay. Safety from what? Well, principally it's gendered family violence. Okay. So if you think about the life of Australian family law over 50 years, imagine that in 2025, its principal business is resolving who should be a parent to the child and how's the child safe with that parent. Whereas 50 years ago, when it started out in 1975, its core business was to help parents focus on their children's needs post-separation. So 50 years ago, it was implicitly implied that children would benefit enormously from having a relationship with both parents. In 2025, 50 years later,
Wow.
That's not an assumption in our family law anymore. They do not assume that. And as an example of that, the presumption of some form of shared parenting, even as an aspirational goal, has been removed from the Family Law Act. Okay, so parents going into family law in Australia are going to be faced with a paradigm or a way of thinking that they would find completely alien. So that's a big social issue. So when we talk about parental alienation is one of many reasons why a child would refuse or resist spending time with a parent. So in that context in Australia, it's kind of implicitly recognised, because family law still retains, as an example of family violence, any action or behaviour that prevents a child from maintaining family relationships. Okay, that's also reflected in coercive control legislation, say in New South Wales, and I think in Queensland it's coming out. But again, it's looked at through a gendered lens. So they kind of recognise that if a child is coerced to reject a parent without good reason, which is the essential definition of parental alienation, that's a violation of the child's best interests. But inevitably, there is a contest in family law between claims of parental alienation or coercive control and claims of gendered family violence. So, we've moved, I would say, in the wrong direction in 50 years. And one proposal I put out there is that Australian family law is at the end of its use-by date and has been for some time on that one.
So clearly,
So, yeah,
sorry, Stan, I was just going to say, so clearly, what we're seeing is there is the whole gender factor is becoming more dominated through the lenses of the family legal process, despite
well, yeah, that's right.
possible facts as well, despite what information or evidence or assessment are put forward to the court.
That's right. So the international research shows that with regard to alienating behaviours, it's a form of emotional psychological abuse. Unfortunately, mums and dads are equally bad at it. Mums and dads both do it more or less equally. Okay.
Yes.
Yet when you look at the gendered family violence research, it nearly always shows that it's a one-sided affair of male on female violence and abuse. They almost never give any credence to the possibility that a woman might exercise their own forms of violence and abuse. There are some statistics from the Australian Bureau of Statistics that suggest that there's not a big difference between men and women when it comes to emotional abuse. Okay. So the gendered narrative has become very dominating and has become a dogma. So what's happened because of the changes in Family Law Act is that your winning strategy is to make an allegation of family violence and child sexual abuse. Why? Because the very first thing that our legal and child protective system does is to take immediate protective action for the child. So the accused parent is automatically barred from spending time with that parent, and there nearly always follows a family violence order of some sort. Okay? So the claim is treated as true without any evidence being tested. Why is that? A woman makes the claim, a child makes the same claim. So part of the gendered dogma is that children always tell the truth. Okay? They always speak their truth. What the world of coercive control and parental alienation says is that, well, sometimes we're not really certain whose truth and whose voice a child is speaking with, but no one is prepared to make that distinction. I mean, I've heard child protection workers say in public, in conferences, oh no, I always go with what the child says. If they say it happened, it happened. So that's the default position. And there's an example of a dogmatic approach to research that then infiltrates policy and law. So if you want to get your child into your own care and responsibility and eliminate the other parent, the best strategy to do that is an allegation of family violence or child sexual abuse, or both. You may not even have to prove it. It doesn't even have to go to a magistrate's court, okay? Because the authorities will act on it without any of that evidence being tested. And then 3 years later, you might get to a trial in a family court, by which time it's almost too late. Child's too old.
That's right.
Okay. So they've set it up in such a way that the system is open to manipulation. It's open to legal and administrative abuse. So we do have incidents of false and misleading allegations of both parental alienation and gendered violence and child sexual abuse. The legal profession know this, but the law constrains them in terms of how they respond. The child protection system doesn't want to know this necessarily because they're locked into a dogma that says children always tell the truth. But the system is open to this kind of abuse. And it backfires on the women and children. They're claiming, the proponents of this approach are claiming it protects. And how does that happen? Well, the same allegations can be made against women. And even though these laws are looked at through a gendered lens, they still have to pass the legal smell test, right? What they call legal pub test would be a better term. You know, this evidence has to be tested in some way. And whether we like the adversarial system or not, at some point, it does test the veracity of these claims at some level. Okay, doesn't always result in a good outcome. As I said, sometimes it can be too late, but they can call out false and misleading allegations.
Stan, does money make a difference for a parent to fight this through the system? Is that now questionable under changes now? Is it making a difference if I have enough money in my pocket to be able to fight those allegations right to the very end?
Absolutely. This is a system for the wealthy. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to get a better outcome
Yes.
through legal processes because these processes are terribly expensive. So in my experience, to rescue a child from an alienating parent, a parent who's coercively controlled them to and emotionally abused them to reject the other parent, 3 years and $500,000. Okay, if you're
Yes.
lucky, who's
Say
got
the
half a
least.
million dollars, let alone 3 years, right?
Yes.
So often, you know, parents are forced to self-represent. So I've yet to come across a self-represented case that has achieved that level of success. At best, there can be legal aid, but legal aid is inherently constrained. Legal aid lawyers are not well paid, so they work according to the budget. Okay. Secondly, if a parent's been accused of family violence, they're not allowed to directly cross-examine the other party. So there is a provision in the Family Law Act to assign a legal aid counsel to administer their case and to conduct cross-examinations. Okay, but it's a very narrow scope of funded illegal aid. So, you know, you'll get a wealthier parent and an under-resourced parent, not always the mum, often the dad. In fact, it's probably, I'd argue anecdotally, it's 50-50. And the wealthier parent has access to legal counsel who knows how to drive the system. And the self-represented litigant often gets driven into dead ends that they can't get out of. And the judge won't entertain any further applications and game over.
So
Okay.
the average person out there who's listening that may not have that financial pool to be able to fight this to the end, which, as you and I both know, is the majority of many of our parents. Given what we are presented with these days with the changes, what's the answer now for them? Where do we go with this? Like, what would be the steps?
So from the top down, it was the political change that I was hoping to happen at this federal election that didn't. Okay. So to be blunt, parents whose children have been taken from them or who are parents of children whose relationship with them have been ruptured for no valid reason have to get politically active. Okay. It needs to become an election issue. Now, it wasn't at this election. All of our political parties were very clever about shaping our thoughts towards cost of living, housing, and immigration, largely. Okay. So you didn't get anyone campaigning on family matters. Okay. And yet, family law is one of the biggest causes of poverty in Australia, I would say, because 2 into 1 doesn't go. Okay. So that's at the very top. So we have to get politically active, even to the extent of forming our own political party. Okay. Why not? Okay. So going right down to the bottom, there are services available. It's not a complete, hopeless situation. Cases, we can challenge the evidence, and we have ways of putting together evidence or assisting parents where their relationships with their children are under threat of navigating their way through a system that could otherwise be hostile to them. Okay. So there's ways of conducting your case, of formulating your evidence, of engaging with the experts, of mediating, that develop advantages to your case that allow the other parent to undermine their own case. Okay. So, for example, in claims of family violence, it's usually a hopeless task to oppose them, to say, no, I didn't do it, because you have to prove a negative, right? It's harder to prove you didn't do something than if you did do something. Okay. But what you can do is allow the other parent to undermine their own case. Okay. So in the cases of family violence claims that are false and misleading, usually, very often, that parent's just gone to the internet and just ticked all the boxes. So
Correct.
they're listing virtually every single form of family violence, coercive control that could possibly have been committed has been listed in their affidavit material. Okay. Often with the thinnest of evidence to support it. Okay. And one reason is, again, the dominant narrative, they are expecting to be treated as though they are telling the truth without any further testing. Okay. Now, in many cases, those claims of violence can be undermined. Okay. Because there's not a lot of coherence to them, of internal consistency. And a good cross-examination can undo that very quickly. Same as engaging with the experts at the family court might impose on you. It's about the choice of the expert, and if you don't have a choice of the expert, how to engage them and how to cross-examine them in trial. Okay. So, and although experts are trained in how to deal with a cross-examination, it doesn't mean it's necessarily a comfortable thing when they're caught out. And a close examination of many expert reports can reveal underlying biases and methodological issues that they can be cross-examined about that would cause a judge to go, I'm not sure how much credence I could put on that report. Okay. So I've gone from the very top to what you can practically do. Much of what you can practically do is, you can do as a person self-representing. And what I'm getting at is that we're not entirely powerless. It is an asymmetrical situation, but that's true for David and Goliath. We go back to biblical times and look who won out of that one, right? It's about exploiting the weaknesses that come with perceived strength. Okay. So if
Question.
someone is expecting to be treated as, I'm always telling the truth because I said it happened, their weakness is they don't feel they have to backstop that with evidence.
Question just to raise about the practitioners that are assessing these cases and then in those reports questioned. Is this because there's not enough training or knowledge on the spaces that we are working in? So in terms of understanding the psychology of parental alienation and a parent withholding, is that something that you believe needs to be, new education needs to be presented, or is it something that the court system is set up to not acknowledge that, as we have discussed many times, parental alienation is a thing, and so therefore it's just put aside as not relevant in cases?
So the issue here is that I mean, a quick answer is yes, there has to be much better professional development within family law circles, much better. Okay. It's simply not good enough. The second thing is, how is it not good enough? Well, for one thing, it's politically and ideologically biased. So you'll see if you look at the curriculum vitae of experts that are, appointed to various family court cases, they'll list their training because that's what they're supposed to do. And in that training, they'll often make a point of saying, oh, I'm trained in gendered family violence. That's it.
What does that mean?
I mean, there'll be other things. Well, what that means is they're trained in the idea that men are perpetrators and women only ever act in defence.
Yeah.
That's it. Okay. And so you'll see other things there. They've probably worked in the child protection system. They have been trained in family systems theory. So the three big ones are they've worked in the child protection system, they've been trained in family systems theory, and so they're family therapists, for example, and they've been trained in gendered family violence. Those are the three red flags in an expert's curriculum vitae. That automatically says to me, because they've not been trained in other forms of coercive control or parent-child contact problems or even parental alienation, it means they don't have a frame of reference to look at that. So if someone comes in with an allegation of family violence versus parental alienation or coercive control, whatever you want to call it, their frame of reference is to automatically assume that the parent who's been rejected has at the very least contributed to their rejection, which is a bit like saying if you're a woman and a victim of family violence, you have in part invited that violence onto you. Big no-no, right? Okay. And they're also going to look at, if it's a man involved, they're going to say, well, I'm assuming this person is a perpetrator, and they're going to have to demonstrate that they're not, which is to prove the negative. Okay. So there's an inherent bias in our family law system that's been driven by the political and ideological climate around gendered family violence. Okay. Yet, if you speak to individual lawyers and individual, independent children's lawyers and many of the practitioners who assess these cases, they know that's not all there is. But if they want the work, they have to subscribe to the dominant narrative.
Stan, why is Australia so tough? Why is it so hard here?
I think there's been a very consistent and strategic campaign to make gender and gendered violence the only matters we can discuss. Okay, the proponents of gender, race, inclusivity, equity, diversity, which all have good points. That's not necessarily bad, right? Coupled with gendered violence, have been very, very strategic and clever about how they've become influential in our university sectors, in our schools, in our policy forums, in politics. Okay, if you look at the Labor Party campaign, it's all about gendered violence, and the environment, renewable energy. And so they've coupled together ideologies which they have sold to people as attractive. So if you are a believer in renewable energy as the future of Australia, windmills and wind turbines and solar panels, okay, then you're more likely to vote Labor and Green, who both share also the gendered platform. So your vote is going to the gendered platform because you subscribe to the renewable energy ideology, and you sort of having to choose which of those things are more important to you. So for some people, it's more important to vote for renewable energy. And so the campaign has been very clever. And the other campaign has been comparatively disorganized. What did they campaign on? Well, to be honest with you, I'm having a hard time articulating it. Okay. So that's where the votes are going. And universities are stacked with people who are following the gendered paradigm, and that's where the research gets done. So what a surprise that the Australian Institute of Family Studies issues a report saying, what is it, 1/4 of men have engaged in some kind of family violence. I mean, yes, that's a terrible statistic. But what about the women? We don't hear that. Okay. So our social problem is not only that men engage in these forms of violence, and yes, they do kill their female partners, but the women also engage in forms of violence. So we have a much bigger social problem than we're told about. But that
That we're
research
talking about. Mm.
was gendered.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think it's important for us to stress this is not a discussion against ignoring domestic violence against women, but more about acknowledging that we have parents on both sides that are
That's right.
part of the contribution to this
Well,
breakdown.
that's correct. And the issues of relational violence, whatever you
Yes.
want to call it, intimate partner violence, you know, situational family, whatever you want to call it.
We're
Okay.
just not having the
It is,
conversations.
we're not having those conversations, and we're not producing the research that tells us what sort of social issue we're having, what are the socio-economic costs of that total problem, and what should our policies be. I'll give you an example of how this gets skewed. So New South Wales legislation on coercive control has within its provisions that preventing a child from having family relationships is a form of coercive control. Okay. Sounds good on paper, right? I had a look at that legislation. I looked at all of the bodies that the legislators consulted in the formulation of that legislation. I could not identify one fathers group or a family-oriented group. They were literally all, as far as I could tell, happy to be called out on that, as far as I could tell, they were all gendered family violence advocates. So that tells me that although the law is framed in a non-gendered way, it'll be interpreted through a gendered lens. And that's the clever campaigns that have been run for quite some time. Things have changed enormously if you think about the whole span of feminism, and from what I can read of it, women engage in a very noble pursuit from the 19th century for equity and equality. Okay. And they faced enormous opposition from men for that. Okay. In the 1960s and 70s, they became very radicalized and extremist in certain ways. That's what they called second wave feminism. Okay. And that's when the idea started to be formulated that the family is not a social institution that benefits women and children. So some of them want to abolish the family. They certainly want to end patriarchy. Well, it's no great friend to me, so I wouldn't be a defendant of patriarchy, that's for sure. But I'm not enthusiastic about matriarchy either, or any other form of dictatorship, because that's what they are. So if you roll forward from the 1960s and 70s, those women promoting extremist ideas became embedded in the academic university sector. And so their ideas started to infiltrate into policy areas and now our laws. Okay. So not all those ideas are bad, like equity and equality and racial discrimination. These are good things. We want to address these things. But the universal emphasis on gender, as though that is the only matter that we can discuss, that is a politically motivated focus. And a lot of these extremists, and that's what I call them, these are radical extremists. Okay, they're immune to logic. they're driven by a political ideology that doesn't center the family in society, that thinks the family is a threat to the state. They do not believe that families should be autonomous, that parents should have the right to bring up their children the way they want. And so they're actively seeking to destroy the family. And alienation is one of the ways of doing that. So parents who use alienating behaviours are responding to a political climate that says it's okay to do that. They know exactly what they're doing.
Absolutely. And with so many parents now that are impacted by this, why isn't there a shift? Why are we not coming together? I mean, you're mentioning the political front, but what is it that is stopping?
Okay, so
help us
this is what
understand
I would observe. So if you, at any given time in anyone's news feed, there will be a horrible story, an appalling story of a woman who's been killed by their male partner.
Yeah.
Or has suffered some terrible form of emotional, psychological abuse or coercive control. Okay, all right. And everyone responds in horror, and in all the chats and comments, they simply repeat the dogma. No, it's gendered family violence again. We really should do more about it, etc., etc., etc. Okay. There's hardly ever a story of a father, for example, who has been ejected from their house on a false and malicious claim of family violence, whose loving relationship with a child has been ruptured by their female ex-partner's behaviour. Okay. Another example, there was a recent horrible story of a mother who allegedly killed her 3-year-old daughter, I think a daughter, whose body was found in the front yard. The mother was arrested on suspicion of murder, I believe, and later died in jail, became very unwell. Okay. I'm not really seeing a lot of narratives about that. Okay. I can expect that the narrative will end up being that she suffered from some form of mental health issue. Okay. And what a terrible situation. There are inadequate social resources available to support this woman. Where were her supports? Okay. So then if you flip this around, if it had been a father who'd killed his 3-year-old daughter and her body found in the front yard and he was arrested and then he died in jail, people would say, well, yeah, good. He was evil. He was bad. We've got rid of him. Okay. No one would be saying where were the mental health supports for him. Okay. So you end up with a one-sided narrative. The point I'm getting at is that we're not parents who've lost contact with their children, where their relationships have been ruptured, alienated parents, have not been as forthright or good at getting their stories out into the mainstream media. Okay. For one reason, because mainstream media is not interested, it's captured by the dominant narrative. Okay. But again, we're not getting those lived experience stories. And from the get-go, from the 1960s onwards, extreme radical feminists, and I distinguish between extreme radical feminists and feminists, okay, right? They have been very, very good at manipulating the social message. Okay, so very simply, they've been campaigning on social issues and political issues from the get-go, whereas the field of parental alienation has been campaigning on scientific issues. Okay, unfortunately, public sentiment trumps science, as we're seeing with some of the ideas floating around right now. So I would say we have to change. Alienated parents in particular have to become politically active and on the front foot, getting their stories out there and demanding to know why they're not being published. Okay, when the same story of a woman being killed by an ex-partner is published. Another example I'll give you is a couple of years ago, there was an article in the in the Age, I think it was, the Victorian police were going to reopen investigations into women who had died from suicide in the context of family violence. And the reason why they're reopening those cases, well, they're going to recategorize those suicide deaths as family violence deaths. In other words, what they're saying is that these women would not have died were it not for the family violence they were allegedly exposed to. In other words, they were coerced or induced to die from suicide. In other words, they were induced to suicide. Okay? Right? And at that time, I wrote an article saying, well, if that's the case, parents exposed to alienating behaviours who die from suicide, who happen to be overwhelmingly men, are also have died by proxy murder. They were induced into their suicide by what the behaviours they were exposed to. Okay, shock horror. Nothing really happened. Okay, so we've got to get better at not just the science, that just has to keep going, but at getting the message to the public and to lawmakers and policymakers that it's simply not good enough. They're not dealing with the true socioeconomic costs of ignoring half the problem.
So if I'm a person, a male that wants to get married, where would that be, or partner and have children? Which country would be the best country for me to be living in on the event that I separate?
Right now,
Yeah.
if I had to pick a country to do that in, it'd be Denmark.
Tell me why.
Denmark is ahead of the game right now in terms of their family violence and family law legislation. So my understanding is in Denmark, they absolutely recognise, all forms of family violence at an equal level. So alienating a child against a parent is regarded as equally violating the child's best interest and welfare as any other form of family violence. And so they don't have, or they've got rid of that dominant narrative around, well, men are perpetrators, women and children are victims. Okay. So I'd probably feel better about Denmark than anywhere else right now. Okay. In other countries, I mean, the UK is, I think, better than Australia. It's a hotly contested issue in the UK. There's a body in the UK called the Family Justice Council, which has issued a guidance on how to deal with claims of parental alienation and family violence. So my reading of that guidance is that it grudgingly accepts that parental alienation happens, but says it comes second to family violence. In other words, you must first presume that it's gendered family violence, and when you can no longer sustain that presumption, then you can look into it as parental alienation. That goes against all the standard validated assessment models, but that's a political decision, okay? But still, it's better than where we are in Australia. In certain parts of Europe, there's certainly some countries that subscribe to the European Court of Human Rights. The European human rights legislation is very clear that parents and children have a right to family life and a right to parent-child relationships. So there is a case in 2019, and I can't remember which country it was in, maybe it was Romania, that upheld that very strongly in a particular case and held the state liable for not providing a timely and effective remediation. Okay, so maybe Romania could be a good place to get married in. Okay, there you go. You got to
countries like Greece, for example. In order to, there's really not much around domestic violence intervention orders as such. You have to be a criminal that's committed let's say murder or some other serious crime where an intervention order is then valid. But if you're a family member and feel you're at risk, there's no platform that would provide you a protection order as such. And so you tend to see lesser noise around this topic. Does parental alienation happen and work? Absolutely. Child abduction, a lot happening across those countries. But in saying all of that, there's a difference of the way that they're operating in terms of those matters, how they're flying into court, where to prove an allegation of domestic violence, it's quite a lengthy process. So it goes before panels. So it's not just a matter of you're not met with just one magistrate. You're met with a team of magistrates in the one courtroom. So again, you see such differences. So why are we not following suit to why, as a country that talks about the safety of children, the support of the family unit, the whole Aussie culture of supporting our families. Why are we not following or replicating some of these other countries that are working well under that narrative? Why is it that we are so hard to deal with, and why is it getting even more difficult? Is it money? Is it a political run? What is it
A
that's
couple of things.
driving
Going
us?
back to your comment about Greece, that's very interesting. I wonder what the gendered family violence proponents would say about Greece. Okay. And it doesn't, just because they have the legislation they have, doesn't mean there's no family violence. It just means it's
Correct.
more difficult to capture it within
That's
a
right.
protective framework.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we'd have to have a close look at how that protects men, women, and children, for
Yes.
argument's sake.
Yes.
Okay. I would say this, just based on my observations internationally, the situation in Denmark has been well managed strategically by proponents of, not necessarily proponents of parental alienation so much, but proponents of the family as being central to society. Okay. They've been able to gain traction within their political and legal system, I think, because of the way they brought lived experience stories to the public domain. And they've been able to successfully challenge that dominant narrative from gendered family violence proponents. Okay. We haven't been able to do that here yet. Okay. One reason might be that, I mean, we kind of saw this in COVID-19, that Australians are pretty complacent, generally speaking. We're not given to rocking the boat too much, nor do we necessarily are attracted to extreme ideas from whichever direction they come from.
Are we
So
lazy,
people,
Stan? Is it laziness? Is there a culture of
well,
laziness?
I would say if you look at Australia historically, Australians have never had to fight for their freedom. Okay,
Good point.
Australia started out as a prison, right? And so the best we could say is that those who are descended from people who came in the First Fleet, particularly the ones who were criminalised in the UK system at the time, or were refugees from Ireland and Scotland, they know what oppression is, but they were essentially prisoners. And so we never had a war of revolution or a war of freedom in Australia like the Americans had. Okay. So we have taken for granted the freedoms our Constitution gives us and the absence of freedoms that it doesn't actually state very clearly. Okay, there's no Bill of Rights in the Constitution, right? So lazy, complacent, people like me whose parents came from a European background who were subjected to pretty awful dictatorships and threats to life as a result of what they were, not who they were. Okay. Yeah, I've grown up in a culture where your freedom is only as good as you're prepared to stand for it. Okay. I think we've lost that in Australia, what little we had of it. Okay. Whereas if you compare us to Americans in certain ways, Americans will be generally affronted at any attempt to undermine their individual rights, and will take that's a matter of human rights for them, and their courts are more likely to uphold that. I mean, they have amendments in their constitution to guarantee them certain rights, which I mean some of us have difficulty with, but it's the process. We don't have that.
So now going forward, obviously with the changes, you and I have been doing some work with parents that were quite enmeshed in the parental alienation pathway. And given those changes, one of the things that we are going to be doing and opening fairly shortly is supporting the early intervention of PA. So do you want to chat a little bit about that? Because I think, that's important in terms of, for the many parents that sometimes that do come to us that say, I don't want to withhold and I'm not alienating. However, you and I both know the seeds can start to spill over very early. So what do we...
I think
Yeah.
if we can get in early enough,
Yes.
oh, prevention everywhere is always better, cheaper
Absolutely.
than shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted, right? Cures, if possible, are always more expensive than prevention. So, as I said, there are more reasons than just alienating behaviours for parent-child contact problems. If we can get in early enough, it's possible to orient both parents at a time when they're more amenable to the cost-benefit trade-offs, if I can use that term, about taking matters too far into the legal system. We can get them to realise there's still a basis for some form of shared care that's going to benefit your child, and both of you will have a relationship with your child. If we can get that in early enough, we could save a lot of heartache. Once it gets into the legal system requires each parent to polarize their case against the other. Okay. And so your opportunities start narrowing down. So we want to get there beforehand. And there are some really clever ways of, when I say mediating, this is a negotiation that with good strategies could achieve better outcomes than you can get from family law if we can get in early enough.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's so important for parents out there to understand that for us, it's not about targeting who's doing wrong, who's doing what. It's the focus being the children and what are those steps that we need to take, acknowledging what those perspectives are of both parents. But then how do we also provide that individual support, help the parents gain some leverage in their own understanding of, what now looks like and what the future can look like if we keep out of that arena, because the court space is going to not only create this emotional explosion, but it's a fueling game, isn't it? And it's just the start of destruction. And you may not see it if the children are small, but as time goes on, children, one of the things I've been sharing with many this week is people are forgetting that children do get older. And so...
Oh, that's right. That's actually a really good point.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I see parent-child relationships fall over is because parents are parenting defensively against the other
Yes.
parent.
Yes.
And they've lost sight of their children. I think we want to get in early enough while parents still have some rationality and still remember who their children are and what their children need. So, yes, some parents engage in alienating behaviors. They're not necessarily going to escalate those behaviors if we can help them address both the objective things they're after and the subjective things they're after. Okay. If we allow it to slip through the net, then the situation gets polarized to the point where they can't shift anymore.
No.
Okay. Or it's more difficult to shift. But even if you're in the family law system, there's always opportunities to negotiate, but you have to work very hard to do so from a position of strength.
And the power
to
is
level that playing
removed.
field.
Power is removed. So parents have to understand that once the court system has now activated, power of your own parental right to your child is
That's right.
removed. So it makes it,
Well,
it just
that's right. That's a
makes
very
no
good
sense.
point.
Makes no
Yes.
sense.
Yeah. No, that's right. So once you're in the family law system, you aren't in control. Okay.
Right.
You're appealing to a higher authority who may not accept your beliefs and values about what's important to you as a family.
And the risks, whether they're seen as worth it or not, is it needs to be questioned on
That's right.
so
That's a
many
good
merits.
starting point for early
Yeah.
intervention.
Absolutely. So for anyone that is out there that is struggling or feels that even if it's possible parental alienation, you can reach out through the PTA Parenting Together Apart for Parents Not Together website and book a free consultation. And that way, that gives us time to speak to you, really work out whether, this is something we can help you with or whether we need to direct you. And this is, the wonderful part about this whole journey is providing you another space where you're still in that space of power, but also how do we start to break down those concerns and, how do we counsel through those in order to, get you to an outcome a lot more sooner at the best possible chance, understanding, all the narratives, obviously, and the variables that will come with your story, but it's definitely free conversation is always worth taking advantage of. Stan, as usual, thank you so much for popping into it. It's always good to talk to you, Stan.
Well, always good to talk to you too, Judy. Thank you so much.
It's been great. And again, for anyone else, if you do feel like you need to still seek legal advice, please do so. Understand that our program is designed for education knowledge. And so we look forward to seeing you at the next podcast real soon. Take care, everyone.
If you or someone you know could do with our help, please book that free consultation at Parenting Together Apart for Parents Not Together. Remember, you don't need to do this alone. We'll look forward to meeting you soon.